Hello! My name is Teacher Jan, and we're so excited to be your instructors this day. Hello there! In today's discussion, we will talk about the national government agencies accounting for revenue, other receipts, and financial statements. But before that, let's define revenue and receipts. Is revenue. Revenue is the gross inflow of economic benefits or service potential during the reporting period when those inflows results in an increase in equity other than increases relating to contributions from the owners. So revenue, we can only consider yung mga received or receivable by the entity in its own account. While sa receipts naman, these are the actual cash collections from all the sources during the period. Ngayong alam na natin yung definition ng dalawa, let's go to the deeper information regarding these two, starting on the fundamental principles for revenue. These fundamental principles are composed of 10 points. First, all revenues of an entity shall be remitted to the national treasury and included in the general fund of the national government unless another law specifically allows otherwise. Second, all monies and property received by a public officer acting in any capacity or upon any occasion shall be accounted for as government funds and government property, unless another law specifically states otherwise. Next, amount received in trust and from business type activities of the government may be separately recorded and disbursed in accordance with relevant rules. Fourth, receipts shall be recorded as revenue for special, fiduciary, or trust funds or funds other than the general funds only when authorized by the law. Fifth, a collecting officer shall immediately issue an OR upon collecting a payment of any nature. Sixth, where mechanical devices are used to acknowledge cash receipts, the Commission of Audit or COA may approve upon request the exemption from the use of accountable forms. Next, never be used to acknowledge the receipt of public funds. Next, pre-numbered ORs shall be issued in strict numerical sequence. Duplicate copies shall be the exact copies of the original. Next, a collecting officer shall accept payments to the government in the form of checks upon proper endorsement and identification of the payee or endorsee. The collecting officer shall not use government funds to encash private checks. And lastly, receipt of government funds shall be acknowledged in accordance with the law, which indicates the date of receipt, from whom and on what the account Now, let's proceed to the types of funds. Here, we have 7 funds. Starting off by General Fund. Basically, it is a fund which is available for any purpose other than those which other funds have been designated to. Since, di ba nga, may iba't ibang classification funds. Second is Special Fund. From the name itself, it is a fund designated for special purposes only. Third is Trust Fund. Ito naman yung fund na hawak ng government agency or any public officer na nag-act as trustee, agent, or administrator for the fulfillment of a condition. Fourth is yung Revenue Fund. So, syempre, ito naman yung fund na nanggagaling sa income na nakukuha ng government agency which is available for appropriation or expenditure, but still in accordance with the law. Next is Depository Fund. This fund naman is held by an authorized depository bank in which the recipient agency. For the second to the last fund, ito naman yung special account in the General Fund or SAGF. It is a fund established to facilitate the funding of priority projects of the government. Yung SAGF, nanggagaling siya from specific fees, grants, and donations, and other sources pa which is identified under the law. Last but definitely not the least, Special Purpose Funds or SPFs. These are the funds that the President allocates for special programs and projects. Unlike the other funds, yung SPFs hindi siya under ng isang particular government agency or unit. Now, let's talk about the sources of revenue. Revenues may arise from two transactions. It can be from exchange transactions or non-exchange transactions. Exchange transactions are reciprocal transfers were transactions in which one entity receives assets or services or has liabilities extinguished, and that directly gives approximately equal value to another entity in exchange. Examples are sales of goods and rendering of services. While non-exchange transactions are those non-reciprocal transfers where transaction in which an entity either receives value from another entity without directly giving approximately equal value in exchange, or give values to another entity without directly receiving approximately equal value in exchange. Halimbawa naman nito is yung tax revenue, fines and penalties, and donations. Not immediately clear whether a transaction is an exchange or non-exchange transaction, the substance of the transaction shall be examined to determine its type. For example, the sales of goods is normally an exchange transaction. However, if the transaction price is subsidized, the transaction falls within the definition of a non-exchange transaction. Thus, the receipt of trade discounts, quantity discounts, or other reductions in price does not necessarily mean that the transaction is a non-exchange transaction.
Ang revenue ay kinukuha sa dalawang transactions. Una is yung exchange transactions and the other is the non-exchange. Hi, it's me, Teacher Ellie, and I will discuss the revenues received by the NGAs from exchange transactions. Exchange transactions ay yung mga transactions in which one entity receives assets or services. Mayroong extinguished liabilities at direktang nagbibigay ng approximate equal value sa kabilang entity bilang kapalit. The revenue under exchange transactions are sales of goods or provision of services to other parties or to other NGAs. Second one, used by other entity of asset building interest, royalties, and dividends or similar distributions. Under the sales of goods, meron tayong dalawang sources of income. Una is yung service income and the other one is business income. The fees under the service income are permit, registration, licensing, legal, and other fees in related sa mga services na binabayaran natin sa government. Yung mga fees for business income are communication network, transportation system, waterworks, power supply system, hospital fees, share in the profit of joint venture, and other business income. Para naman sa income used by other entity of assets under the interest income, we have the charges for the use of cash or cash equivalents or amounts due to the entity. For the royalties, we have the fees paid for the use of entities' assets such as trademarks, patents, software, and copyrights. For the share of national government from the earnings of its capital, equity investment in government-owned or controlled corporations, we have the dividends. The revenue from the sales of goods are nire-recognize lang kapag lahat ng following conditions are nasatisfied. First, the entity has transferred to the purchaser the significant risks and rewards of ownership of goods. Second, the entity retains neither continuing managerial involvement to the degree usually associated with ownership nor effective control over the goods sold. At nire-recognize lang ang revenue kapag it is probable that the economic benefits or service potential associated with the transaction will flow to the entity. The amount of revenue and the cost incurred or to be incurred in respect to the transactions can be measured reliably. Ang revenue naman for the supply of services shall be only recognized on a straight-line basis over the specified period of the services unless an alternative method better represents the stage of completion of the transaction. When the outcome of a transaction involving the rendering of services can be estimated reliably, revenue associated with the transaction shall be only recognized by reference to the stage of completion of transactions at the reporting date. Practical purposes, kapag ang services ay na-perform by an indeterminate number of acts over a specific time frame, ang revenue ay na-recognize on a straight-line basis over the specified time frame unless there is a better evidence na nagre-represent sa stage of completion. When the outcome of the transactions involving the rendering of services cannot be estimated reliably, ang revenue ay dapat ina-recognize lang only to the extent of the expense recognized that are recoverable. The revenue arising by the use of other entities of asset yielding interest, royalties, and dividends shall be recognized when it is probable that the economic benefits or service potential associated with the transaction will flow to the entity, and the amount of the revenue can be measured reliably. The interest shall be recognized on a time proportion basis that takes into account the effective yield on the asset. Royalties shall be recognized as they earned in accordance with the substance of the relevant agreement. Sa dividends naman, nire-recognize ng revenue kapag ang shareholders or entities' right to receive the payment is established. Lahat ng revenue na nabanggit shall be measured at the fair value of consideration received or receivable. Any amount of trade discount and volume rebates allowed by the entity shall be taken into account. Exchanges of goods or services for similar and dissimilar goods or services are exchanged na may kaparehang nature and value, the exchange is not regarded as transactions na nag-generate ng revenue. However, kapag ang goods na nabenta or yung services na na-render in exchange for the similar goods or services, the exchange is regarded as a transaction na nag-generate ng revenue. The revenue is measured at the fair value of goods or services adjusted by the amount of any cash or cash equivalents transferred. Kapag ang fair value ng goods or services na natanggap cannot be measured reliably, the revenue is measured at the fair value of goods given up adjusted by the amount of any cash or cash equivalent transferred. Impairment losses and allowance for impairment losses. Kapag merong uncertainty na nag-arise about sa collectivity ng amount na already included in revenue, the uncollectible amount or the amount in respect of which recovery has ceased to be probable is recognized on expense or impairment losses. And lastly, for the disclosure, the entity shall disclose the accounting policies adopted for the recognition of revenue, kasama na yung mga methods adopted to determine the stage of completion ng transactions involving the rendering of services. The entity shall also disclose the amount of each significant category of revenue recognized during the period, including the revenue arising from the rendering of services, sales of goods, interest, royalties, dividends or similar distributions, and any amount of revenue arising from the exchange of goods or services included in each significant category of revenue.
Did you know that revenues may arise from non-exchange transactions? This is Teacher Sam, and if you want to know more about this topic, please keep on watching. Non-exchange transactions are transactions in which an entity gives or receives value from another entity without directly providing something of equal value in return. Revenue from these transactions are derived mostly from taxes, fines and penalties, gifts, donations, and goods in kind. We all know that taxes are compulsory payments intended to provide revenue to the government, while yung fines and penalties naman ay mga monetary sanctions na na-receive as a consequence of breach of laws. Yung gifts, donations, and goods in kind are voluntary transfers of assets that one entity makes to another and normally free from stipulations. Assets, liabilities, and revenue arise from a non-exchange transaction, and usually iba-iba yung measurement niya. Kapag asset, fair value at the acquisition date. Kapag liabilities naman, at present value when the effect of time value of money is material. However, kapag revenue, at the amount of increase in net assets. If yung transaction is initially recognized as a liability, mare-recognize lang siya as revenue kapag ka na-fulfill na yung condition. As to the recognition of revenue from non-exchange transactions, on a cash basis yon until a reliable measurement model is developed. So yung asset, liability, and revenue that arise from these transactions are recognized kapag na-collect na siya or kapag ka naman measurable and legally collectible. Tax revenue is recognized at a gross amount and not reduced for expenses paid through the tax system. Yung expenses paid through the tax system ay yung mga expenses na kailangang bayaran irrespective of whether the taxpayer pays taxes or uses a particular mechanism to pay taxes. For example, the government pays a part of residents' health insurance premium through reducing its tax liability, making payment by check, or by paying an amount directly to the insurance company. Consequently, yung amount na yon ay expense ng government and kailangang i-recognize separately in the statement of financial performance. Another point, tax revenue shall not be grossed up for the amount of tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are preferential provisions of the tax law that provide certain taxpayers with concessions that are not available to others. Ang tax expenditure ay foregone revenue at hindi expenses. For example ay yung Tax Expenditure Fund. Ito yung subsidy na nirelease ng DBM sa mga government-owned or controlled corporations pati na sa government financial institutions para masettle yung mga custom duties and yung mga taxes na nag-a-arise sa importation of goods. This is also to settle the benefits granted to taxpayers like the tax credits. Ano naman yung mga type of tax na nabibigay ng revenue sa government? So we have the income tax, value-added tax or yung VAT, goods and services tax, custom duty, debt duty, and property tax. Transfers. Transfers are inflows of future economic benefits or service potential from non-exchange transactions other than taxes. Transfers include fines, gifts, donation, goods and service in kind, debt forgiveness, bequest, and grants. Proceeding, fines and penalties are recognized as income in the year they are collected. However, nire-recognize lang yung fines as revenue when the receivable meets the recognition criteria for asset. Assets arising from fines are measured at the best estimate of the inflow of resources to the entity. We should note that an entity collecting fines in the capacity of an agent shall not treat those fines as revenue. Gifts, donations, and goods in kind. Gifts and donations are recognized as asset and revenue when it is probable that the future economic benefits or service potential will flow to the entity and the fair value of the assets can be measured reliably. The making of the gift or donation and the transfer of legal title are often simultaneous. In such circumstances, there is no doubt as to the future economic benefits flowing to the entity. On the other hand, goods in kind are tangible assets transferred to an entity in a non-exchange transaction without charge but may be subject to stipulations. Goods in kind are recognized as asset when the goods are received or there is a binding arrangement to receive the goods. If goods in kind are received without conditions attached, revenue is recognized immediately. If conditions are attached, a liability is recognized, which is reduced. Revenue is recognized as the conditions are satisfied. On initial recognition, minimeasure natin yung gifts, donations, and goods in kind at their fair value as of the date of acquisition, which may be ascertained by reference to an active market or by appraisal. Services in kind. Services in kind are services provided by individual to public sector entities in a non-exchange transaction, but due to the uncertainties affecting the entity's ability to control those services and to measure them at fair value, services in kind are not recognized as revenue. Examples of services in kind include technical assistance from foreign bodies, community services rendered by persons convicted of offenses, volunteer services, and the like. It is encouraged to disclose the nature and type of services in kind received during the reporting period. Disclosures relating to services in kind are only made if they are material. For some public sector entities, the services provided by volunteers are not material in amount but may be material in nature.
Hi students, I'm Teacher Jack, and the next topic that I will discuss is about the bequest. Bequest or transfers made according to the provisions of a deceased person's will. Sa madaling salita, ito ay isang pamana. Bequest is a financial term describing the act of giving assets such as stocks, bonds, jewelry, and cash to individuals or organizations through the provisions of a will or an estate plan. Bequest can be made to the family members, friends, institutions, or charities. When real estate is left through a will, it is called a device. Naman yung accounting treatment ng bequest. A bequest will satisfy the recognition criteria for asset is recognized as revenue, measured at a fair value of the resources received or receivable. So now, let's talk about grant with condition. Ang mga asset na na-receive under a grant with condition ay initially recorded or recognized as liability. Saka lang siya i-recognize as revenue pag na-satisfy niya na yung condition. Mas madaling yung maintindihan, ibibigay ako ng example. For an instance, the national government received a foreign grant of 10 million pesos conditioned on the construction of a flood control system, which must be completed within the next 2 years. Otherwise, the grant must be returned to the grantor. The DPWH is the implementing entity. Ano nga ba natin ire-record yan? To proceed to the recordings of transactions, meron po tayong dalawang books. Ang unang book ay yung kay national government. At yung pangalawang book ay yung kay DPWH, which is the implementing entity. Kaya kailangan nyo din ng records. So proceed sa book ni national government. Paano nga ba yung initial recordings o paano yung initial journal entry ni national government? National government received a foreign grant worth 10 million pesos. They will now debit cash in bank dash NC, BSP, and credit other deferred credit for 10 million pesos. Teka, ano nga ba yung deferred credit? Deferred credit is kept as a liability on the balance sheet until the revenue is actually earned. Naging ganyan yung credit ni national government kasi hindi niya pa talaga na-earn yung na-receive niyang 10 million from the foreign grant. So how will we record naman sa books ni DPWH? We will debit cash modified disbursement system, regular 10 million, and credit subsidy from national government, 10 million. So what does the modified disbursement system means? MDS means a check issued by the government agencies chargeable against the account of the Treasurer of the Philippines. Paano naman yung pag-record ng disbursements for materials and labor amounting to 10 million pesos? Magiging journal entry niyan sa books ni national government is debit subsidy from national government, 10 million, and credit cash in bank local currency BSP, 10 million. Ito ay para ma-recognize yung replenishment ng MDS checks issued for payment of the materials and labor for the construction of a flood control system. Journal entry naman sa books ni DPWH ay debit construction in progress dash infrastructure assets 10 million and credit cash dash modified disbursement system regular 10 million pesos. Ito naman ay para sa pag-record ng disbursement ng cash from MDS para sa pagpapagawa ng infrastructures or the flood control system. Paano naman natin i-record pag na-complete na yung project? So, pumunta muna tayo sa books ni national government. Ang ide-debit natin ay other deferred credits, 10 million. Ang sabi ko nga sa inyo kanina na ang deferred credits ay mananatili sa liability section until the revenue is actually earned. Kaya ayan, nasa debit na siya ngayon dahil na-complete niya na yung project at na-satisfy niya na yung condition na gawin yung flood control system. Now, we will credit donation in cash, 10 million pesos. Pumunta naman tayo ngayon sa books ni DPWH. So now, we will debit flood control system and credit construction in progress infrastructure asset, 10 million pesos. This is the record that DPWH completed the construction of the flood control system, worth 10 million pesos. Okay, tapos na tayo sa grant with condition. Now let us go to the topic pledge. Pledges are unenforceable undertakings to transfer asset to the recipient entity. Ang mga pledge or pledges ay hindi nare-recognize as revenue kasi they do not meet the recognition criteria for asset. So if the pledge item is subsequently transferred to the recipient entity, it is recognized as gift or donation. Concessionary loans. When we say concessionary loans, these are loans received by an entity below market terms. So basically, these are loans that offer more generous terms than market rate. Terms may be lower interest rates, a longer payback period, or grace period. These allow different kinds of borrowers to access capital at terms that are affordable and offer the flexibility that borrower requires. The entity considers whether the difference between the transaction price and the fair value of the loan on initial recognition is non-exchange transaction. If it is so, the difference is recognized as revenue, except if a present obligation exists, in which case the difference is recognized as liability and recognized as revenue only when the condition is satisfied. Impairment loss rather than as an adjustment to the revenue originally recognized. Entities shall evaluate the collectability of accounts receivable on an ongoing basis based on historical bad debts, customer or recipient creditworthiness, current economic trends, and changes in payment activity. An allowance is provided for known and estimated bad debts.
Let's proceed to our next topic, which is the other receipts. Other receipts include but not limited to the following. Una, meron tayong receipt of subsidy or assistance from the national government or other government agencies including LGUs and GOCCs, receipt of excess cash advance granted to officers and employees, receipt of refund of overpayment of expenses, receipt of performance bond or security deposit, collections made on behalf of another entity, accounting for overage or shortage of collecting officer, and intra-agency and interagency fund transfers. As to the recognition, the subsidy from national government and other NGAs is recognized as revenue from assistance and subsidy. However, yung mga receipts na nabanggit ko besides that, hindi na siya nire-recognize as revenue. Examples of receipt of subsidy from the national government are Notice of Cash Allocation or NCA, Tax Remittance Advice, Non-Cash Availment Authority, and Cash Disbursement Ceiling. So for this discussion, mag-focus muna tayo sa Tax Remittance Advice. Tax Remittance Advice is a serially numbered document prescribed by the DBM and ginagamit siya ng mga NGA sa pagre-remit ng mga withheld taxes and funds coming from the DBM. Tignan natin tong sample problem dito. Entity A remits 15,000 withheld to the other government agencies. The breakdown is provided below. Meron tayong withholding tax amounting to 10,000, GSIS and Pag-ibig na tig 2,000, tsaka yung 1,000 na PhilHealth. So, the remittance of the tax withheld is recorded in the books of the entity, the BIR, and the Bureau of Treasury. So, para sa books of entity, ang debit natin dyan ay cash na tax remittance advice amounting to 10,000 and ang credit natin is subsidy from national government. This is to recognize the constructed receipt of NCA for TRA. Pero meron pa yung succeeding na entry para naman ma-recognize yung constructive remittance of taxes withheld to the BIR through TRA. Debit na due to BIR and i-credit natin yung cash na tax remittance advice. Yung TRA, another form siya ng disbursement authority and parehas lang din yung record nila ng receipt ng NCA. Sa books ng BIR, meron silang debit na cash from TRA tsaka credit na income tax. While sa books ng Bureau of Treasury, ang debit nila is subsidy to NGAs at ang credit is cash from TRA. Next point, pagka naman subsidy or assistance from other government agencies, including LGUs and GOCCs, nag-i-issue ng collecting officer ng official receipt upon receipt of any of these subsidies or assistance. Ang entries natin doon is debit na cash from collecting officers and credit na subsidy from other NGAs o kaya naman assistance from LGU or assistance from GOCCs. This is to recognize the receipt of subsidy or assistance from other government agencies. Para naman i-recognize the remittance of collections to Bureau of Treasury, ang debit natin is cash from Treasury or agency deposit and a credit to cash from collecting officers. Third point is the refund of excess cash advances granted to officers and employees. So, meron siyang mga classifications. Ang una is yung advances to officers and employees, which is for official travels. Pangalawa is yung advances for operating expenses na ginagrant naman sa disbursing officer para sa mga operating expenses ng units and yung mga foreign posts na hindi nagme-maintain ng complete set of books. And yung pangatlo is yung advances for payroll, which is for the salaries, wages, and other personal benefits. The recognized collection of refund of excess cash advances, ang debit natin is cash from collecting officers, and ang credit natin pwede siyang advances to officers and employees, advances for operating expenses, or advances for payroll. And the recognized remittance of collections to Bureau of Treasury, ang entry natin is a debit to cash from Treasury or agency deposit, and yung credit natin is cash from collecting officers. Kapag mag-record naman tayo ng receipt of refund of overpayment of expenses, ang debit natin is cash from collecting officers, and yung credit is yung appropriate expense account. This is to recognize the collection of refund of overpayment of expenses. Para naman i-recognize yung remittance na collection sa Bureau of Treasury, ang debit is cash from Treasury or agency deposit, and ang credit is yung cash from collecting officers. Fifth is yung receipt of performance bond or security deposit. So, ang performance bond, isa siyang security deposit na required from a contractor or supplier para mag-guarantee yung full performance ng contract. It may be in the form of cash or certified check. The journal entries are as follows. Ang debit natin ay cash from collecting officers, and ang credit natin is yung guarantee or security deposits payable. This is to recognize the collection of performance bond or security deposit. Para naman ma-recognize yung remittance of collections to Bureau of Treasury, ang record natin is a debit to cash from Treasury or agency deposit, and credit ulit natin is yung cash from collecting officers. Sixth is yung collections made on behalf of another entity or non-government or private organizations. Ito yung mga receipts of income, receivables, or trust funds for the account of other NGAs, LGUs, GOCCs, or non-government or private organizations. These collections are later remitted to the government agencies or non-government or private organizations concerned. As an illustration, Agency X collected fees accruing to the University of the Philippines Legal Research Fund in the amount of 3,000 and remitted the same to the Bureau of Treasury. The UP Legal Research Fund and Bureau of Treasury appropriately recognized this in their respective books. So sa books ng Agency X, merong debit to cash from collecting officers and a credit to due to NGAs. This is to recognize the collection of fees accruing to the UP LRF. Para naman ma-recognize yung remittance of collections sa BTR for the account of UP LRF, meron siyang debit to due to NGAs and a credit to cash from collecting officers. Sa books ng Bureau of Treasury, meron ring entry para ma-record yung receipt of remitted collection for UP LRF. May debit silang cash in bank from local currency or savings account and a credit to cash from Treasury or agency deposit. Sa books ng UP LRF, may debit na cash from Treasury or agency deposit and a credit to trust liabilities to recognize the remitted collections for UP LRF by other NGAs. Let's proceed to the accounting for cash overage or shortage of collecting officer. So, yung mga cash overage daw na na-discover by auditor that cannot be satisfactorily explained by the collecting officer ay mafo-forfeit in favor of the government, and an official receipt shall be issued by the collecting officer. This overage shall be taken up as a miscellaneous income, while the cash shortage which is not restituted by the collecting officer despite the demand in writing by the auditor shall be taken up as a receivable from the collecting officer. As an illustration, during cash examination by the resident auditor, cash overage in the amount of 500 was discovered in the possession of the collecting officer. Said amount was forfeited and deposited in the Bureau of Treasury. To record the following transactions, ang entry natin is debit to cash from collecting officers and a credit to miscellaneous income. That is to recognize the forfeiture of cash overage of the collecting officer, while to recognize the remittance of the forfeited cash overage to Bureau of Treasury, ang debit natin is cash from Treasury or agency deposit and a credit to cash from collecting officer. In case naman na may cash shortage, ang record natin doon is a debit to due from officers and employees and a credit to cash from collecting officers. While to recognize the restitution of cash shortage, ang debit natin dun is yung cash from collecting officers and the credit to due from officers and employees. To recognize the remittance of constituted cash shortage to the Bureau of Treasury, may debit tayong cash from Treasury or agency deposit and the credit to cash from collecting officers. Next is the intra-agency fund transfer. So, ito yung cash na na-receive ng entity mula sa central office, regional office, o sa operating units for the purpose of implementing specific projects. As an illustration, in an intra-agency transaction, the central office of DOH made a transfer to its regional office in the amount of 500,000 for the implementation of its campaign against dengue in Zone A of Region 10. Said amount was accordingly remitted to the Bureau of Treasury by the RO. To record the transaction, kailangan mag-debit tayo ng cash from collecting officers and a credit to due to regional offices amounting to 500,000 pesos to recognize the receipt of intra-agency fund transfer. And to recognize the remittance of collections to Bureau of Treasury, ang debit natin doon is yung cash from Treasury or agency deposit and the credit to cash from collecting officers. Lastly is yung inter-agency fund transfer, which is yung cash na na-receive ng entity from another entity for the purpose of implementing specific projects. Under this fund transfer, may mga accounting policies na kailangang i-observe. The entry to recognize the receipt of inter-entity fund transfer is a debit to cash from collecting officers and a credit to due to NGAs, LGUs, or GOCCs. While to recognize the remittance of collections to the Bureau of Treasury, may debit tayong cash from Treasury or agency deposit and a credit to cash from collecting officers.